A political stoush has erupted over BHP Billiton's decision to delay the expansion of the Olympic Dam mine. BHP Billiton says it's shelved the $30 billion South Australian project because of weaker commodity prices and high capital costs. But the opposition leader Tony Abbott is blaming the carbon and mining taxes.
The government says Mr Abbott is running a baseless fear campaign and it hasn't given up hope that expansion will eventually go ahead.
Our political correspondent Melissa Clark joins us now from Parliament House. And Melissa, it didn't take very long for the political blame game to begin.
Certainly, and the Coalition have certainly tried to pin this on the carbon tax and the mining tax, with the opposition leader Tony Abbott saying that it had put pressure on BHP and that had led to the system. Now, this is despite the fact that BHP itself had made it very clear that the capital costs of having the Olympic Dam expansion, as well as lower commodity prices, were the significant and by far the most significant factors in their decision not to go ahead with this expansion, and that they'll now be paying out more dividends to investors as a result. But that didn't deter Tony Abbott. He told 7:30 last night that he thought that Marius Kloppers didn't want to say that, didn't want to blame the government directly, but that's what would have been behind it. And when Tony Abbott was challenged by this, he had to concede that perhaps he wasn't quite as well as informed as he could have been. Let's hear a little bit of his interview with the 7:30's Lee Sales last night.
You're not seriously telling me, Lee, that the mining tax and the carbon tax have made Australia an easier place to invest in?
I'm going on the facts that Marius Kloppers said today when he was directly asked if the decision on Olympic Dam was affected by Australia's tax situation, and I'm going on the facts that are outlined in their results statement that they've issued. Have you actually read BHP's statements?
No, but I've also got again the statement of Jack Nasser, who says while we're still evaluating the impact of the carbon tax, but it just makes it more difficult.
But hang on, no, you haven't read their statements today, but you're on commenting about what they've announced today and how the federal government's to blame for that.
Lee, I didn't say that the carbon tax and the mining tax were solely to blame. I said that the carbon tax and the mining tax have created an environment where it's much more difficult for investments like this to go ahead.
It's the opposition leader Tony Abbott speaking to Lee Sales on 7:30 last night. I'm sure we're going to see that clip played many times, Melissa. But the government was also quick to point out that the delay of the project does not necessarily mean that it won't happen at some point.
And they're quite optimistic that there will be some circumstance in the future where the conditions are more favourable and that expansion can go ahead. They point to the fact that the value of the resources there and that circumstances can change, and that the regulatory hurdles were cleared long ago and can still remain that way if we were to go through this round again. The South Australian government, though, is a little more pessimistic, with the South Australian Premier, Jay Weatherill, saying, obviously being quite disappointed given what a blow it will be to the economy of South Australia. He was making the point that he felt it would be difficult for the South Australian public to go through this process yet again, where there is the expectation that Olympic Dam will be expanded, to have hopes risen and then fall over seemingly at the last hurdle. And he suggested it would be hard for the public to swallow that again anytime soon. So perhaps the bigger concern there being at a state government level as opposed to a federal government level, because from a Commonwealth perspective, they are still optimistic that this may well happen at some point in the future.
Now, we know last week was dominated by the asylum seeker legislation. How's the progress of that going, and where's it at?
Well, what we had last week was that legislation that allowed federal government to have offshore processing, to send asylum seekers to be processed in a third country. And that's what all the parties could agree on. And part of the compromise was that the federal government would then have to nominate individual countries that the Parliament would then either allow or veto. And what we haven't had is the paperwork from the federal government specifically naming Nauru and PNG as the countries where they would have processing, even though they're going through that stage of assessing Manus Island and Nauru for the facilities and getting it ready. Now, the Coalition says the government should have had this naming and regulation documents passed through Parliament during this sitting so that they can get asylum seekers processed offshore as soon as possible. But the government says it's still negotiating diplomatically with Nauru and Papua New Guinea, and that will be done first thing when Parliament resumes after the end of today in a fortnight's time.